Osama bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. His father was Mohammed bin Awad bin Laden, born in Yemen in 1908. As a child, his family emigrated from Yemen to the Red Coast of Western Arabia. This region now constitutes part of Saudi Arabia, but was then contested between the Ottoman Empire and the Royal House of Saud. In the 1930s, he became a prominent construction contractor for the first ruler of Saudi Arabia, Abdul Aziz ibn Saud. With the support of the royal family, the company he established, the Saudi bin Laden Group, became an immensely prosperous and wealthy construction firm in the nascent nation, even as it grew into the world's largest oil exporter and a remarkably affluent nation for successful families like the bin Ladens. Osama's mother was Hamida al-Attas, a native Syrian from a family known for their successful citrus farming around the port city of Latakia. She became Muhammad's 10th wife in 1956 at the age of just 14, marrying the 48-year-old millionaire. A year later, Osama was born. He was their only child, and shortly after, Muhammad and Hamida separated. Osama's childhood and upbringing were characterized by privilege. By the time of his birth, his father was a multimillionaire, although his wealth would easily amount to billions when adjusted for today's inflation. Shortly after his parents' divorce, Osama's mother remarried a business associate of Mohammed bin Laden named Mohammed al-Attas. They had 4 children together in the 1960s, 3 boys and 1 girl. Osama was sent to live with them and thus grew up in his mother's and stepfather's household, alongside several step-siblings. However, it would be inaccurate to say he was distanced from his father. Mohammed bin Laden had a significant influence on his son's upbringing, imparting much of his conservative religious enthusiasm. Starting in 1968, Osama attended the Al-Thagr Model School, a secondary school in Jeddah. In 1971, he experienced the Western world directly when he was sent to Oxford University in Britain. By the 1960s, the Saudi bin Laden Group had become one of the most important corporations in the entire Arab world. Its connections to the Saudi royal family were pervasive, and the company had been awarded contracts to oversee the ongoing repairs of the mosques in the 2 holiest cities in the Islamic world, Mecca and Medina. In 1964, the company obtained the contract to reclad the exterior of the Dome of the Rock, the most significant Muslim religious site in Jerusalem. By that time, the connections between Mohammed bin Laden and the Saudi royal family had grown extremely extensive. However, in 1967, Mohammed was killed at the age of 59 in an airplane accident in Saudi Arabia when the pilot miscalculated the plane's landing. Despite this setback, the Saudi bin Laden Group continued to thrive under the leadership of several of Mohammed's sons from his previous marriages. And indeed, as it expanded in the 1970s and 1980s, it evolved into a multi-billion-dollar corporation with profitable contracts throughout the Middle East. Osama was not engaged in the Saudi bin Laden Group's business activities in the years following his father's death, for the straightforward reason that he was too young. Instead, he was pursuing his education. At 19 years of age in 1976, Osama enrolled at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, where he started studying economics and business administration, certainly to assume some kind of role within the family business in the future. Already, however, he had begun to deviate from an interest in business, with accounts from individuals who knew bin Laden there, indicating that his main interests lay in religion, poetry, and Arab literature. He certainly didn't need to be concerned about finances, his education, and future employment, as Osama stood to inherit more than $30 million from his father's estate. At this point, he was also married, having married his first wife, a Syrian woman named Najwa Ghanem, in 1974, when he was merely 17 years old. She was also his first cousin on his mother's side, and the first of at least 5 wives. Osama would father over 24 children throughout his life. Clearly, the mid to late 1970s were a crucial period in Osama's life and his ideological perspectives, though much of the information regarding these years is frustratingly incomplete and at times contradictory. Nevertheless, the general direction of his views is evident. Osama started to cultivate a Pan-Islamist ideology from an early age in his life, a movement that advocates the notion that Muslims in all countries should come together in defense and advancement of their faith. This belief looks back to the era of the Arab Caliphate, which, between the 8th and 11th centuries, governed most of the Middle East, North Africa, and neighboring regions from the Caliphate's capital in Baghdad. Central to Pan-Islamism in the 1960s and 1970s was a commitment to diminishing and, if feasible, terminating Western involvement in the Middle East, a region that had been under the control of the British and French since the fall of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War, and where the United States was becoming an increasingly involved party even as the British and French influence waned. The Middle Eastern environment that Osama was raised in was also one where the newly established State of Israel, strongly supported by the United States, was often engaged in conflict with its Muslim neighbors, particularly seen in the Six-Day War of 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973. In the 1970s, a particularly profound influence on Osama came from the writings of Sayyid Qutb, an Egyptian Islamic scholar and theorist in religion and politics who had been affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood until his arrest and execution in 1966. Qutb's considerable writings were broadly disseminated in schools and universities throughout the Muslim world, starting from the 1940s, and encompassed claims that Islamic jihad, or the struggle against evil, was completely justifiable for the establishment of a new Islamic caliphate, and that Sharia law, the law derived from a strict interpretation of the Quran, should be enforced across all Muslim nations. A current of anti-Western sentiment also permeated much of Qutb's works, as he condemned the United States as materialistic, devoid of God, and lacking any form of spiritual values. If there was one key influence on bin Laden's ideological views during the 1960s and 1970s, it was indeed Qutb. Osama completed his education at Abdulaziz in 1979. It remains uncertain whether he graduated with a degree or not. This timing was significant, as the Islamic world was experiencing unrest at this time. Firstly, the Iranian Revolution of 1978 resulted in the ousting of the Western-supported Shah in Iran and the establishment of a new Islamic state led by Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Concurrently, to the northeast in Afghanistan, the nation was spiraling into political turmoil. In 1978, the Marxist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, had taken control and started to create a socialist, secular state. The PDPA had enduring connections with the Soviet Union, and indeed Russia had always held an interest in Afghanistan since the mid-19th century, when the country served as a crucial buffer state between Russia and British interests in India and Pakistan. However, there is no substantial evidence that the Soviets were the primary catalyst behind the PDPA's rise to power in Afghanistan in 1978. Nonetheless, they did establish close connections with the new Marxist government in Kabul once it seized control of the nation. Consequently, as Islamist groups and other adversaries of the PDPA began uprisings against the new administration throughout 1978 and 1979, the Marxist regime promptly sought assistance from Moscow. Initial support was limited, but as the situation for the PDPA continued to worsen, the Soviet Union essentially invaded Afghanistan in the final days of December 1979. By early 1980, thousands of Soviet tanks and tens of thousands of soldiers had been dispatched as Moscow occupied the primary cities of the country. Even before the Soviet incursion into Afghanistan, bin Laden had swiftly made his way to Pakistan after completing his education at King Abdulaziz University. Pakistan has played, and continues to play, a crucial role in the global jihadist movements of the 20th and early 21st centuries. Officially, the nation has declared its opposition to Islamic fundamentalism existing on its territory, yet for many years it has chosen to ignore this reality, largely because Muslim Pakistan has been engaged in a protracted Cold War with its long-standing adversary, Hindu India, since the British Raj was partitioned along religious lines in 1947. Over the next 3 decades, Pakistan would be significant in bin Laden's life. Once he arrived there in 1979, he quickly fell under the influence of Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian-born jihadist, who inspired many of the leading Islamic jihadists of the late 20th century. Shortly thereafter, Azzam encouraged bin Laden to join the multitude of Muslim men who were traveling to Afghanistan to combat the atheistic Soviet invaders. These individuals became known as Mujahideen, a term that roughly translates as one who engages in holy war or jihad. In the early 1980s, bin Laden began utilizing his inherited wealth to recruit and train Mujahideen in Pakistan before they ventured into Afghanistan's mountainous areas. Although this funding was trivial compared to the billions of dollars expended by the United States and Saudi Arabian governments on equipping and training anti-Soviet forces in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, which served as their proxies to combat the Soviet incursion. Additionally, while claims about the degree to which bin Laden was financed and trained by American agents during this period have been overstated, it is clear that he did have some limited interactions with U.S. special forces in the area in the 1980s. The conflict to which bin Laden attached himself starting in 1980 unfolded much like battles in Afghanistan have over the last 2 centuries. With 80,000 Soviet troops deployed by the close of 1980 and possessing vastly superior weaponry, they were able to seize and maintain control of the primary cities and support the Marxist PDPA. However, the Mujahideen factions, which included both moderate and fundamentalist groups, largely dominated the regions outside the urban centers. The Hindu Kush Mountains, which primarily characterize much of the country, especially in the east and north, provide ideal terrain for guerrilla warfare, and this precisely defined the nature of the Soviet-Afghan War throughout the 1980s. The combat became extremely brutal as the Soviets employed indiscriminate bombing and the destruction of rural villages in an attempt to eradicate the insurgents. By the mid-1980s, more than 4 million individuals from Afghanistan's total population of 14 million had been displaced, with hundreds of thousands becoming refugees in Pakistan and Iran, while the conflict resulted in at least 500,000 fatalities and possibly up to 3 times that number. It quickly became recognized as the Soviet equivalent of the Vietnam War for Americans, as the Russians encountered an adversary they could not overcome. During this time, bin Laden emerged as a significant figure in the Mujahideen movement in Afghanistan. Initially, he started supplying resources to the fighters in the nation, and also aided in the movement of individuals from his home country of Saudi Arabia to Pakistan, who wished to take up arms against the Soviets, where they would receive training and equipment before being sent north. Over the years, bin Laden traveled between Pakistan and the Mujahideen strongholds located in the Hindu Kush Mountains. In 1984, he and his mentor Abdullah Azzam founded Maktab al-Qidamat, an organization that sought to collect funds from both the Arab and Western worlds to sustain the fight against the Soviets. This financial support was subsequently utilized to buy weaponry and train Mujahideen. By 1986, the network had prepared hundreds of fighters stationed in eastern Afghanistan at bin Laden's base known as al-Masada, the Lion's Den. These fighters led the Mujahideen efforts against the Soviets and the Marxist regime during the Battle of Jaji in the late spring and early summer of 1987. Although the battle ultimately had little strategic importance in the broader conflict, it earned bin Laden considerable acclaim among the Mujahideen and within the larger Arab world. The creation of Maktab al-Qidamat was crucial in the 1980s as it established the foundation for the jihadist movement with which bin Laden has become associated. As the war in Afghanistan neared an unavoidable defeat for the Soviets and the Marxist regime they supported in the late 1980s, considerations turned to the future of the organization. Some members preferred to maintain it as a moderate entity that continued its efforts against the Soviets, but bin Laden, Abdullah Azzam, and others opposed this notion, believing that Maktab al-Qidamat should evolve into a larger organization that would aim to continue the expulsion of non-Arab powers from the Arab and Muslim world. Ultimately, this more radical faction of the movement led bin Laden and Azzam to create a new organization in 1988 known as al-Qaeda, which translates to the base or the foundation. Over time, it would grow to become the largest jihadist organization worldwide and is infamously recognized around the globe as such today. Al-Qaeda's objective from the outset was to initiate a holy war or jihad against non-Muslims anywhere in the conventional Muslim world, which includes the Middle East, Lower Central Asia, the Maghreb and North Africa, and also more peripheral areas of the Muslim world, such as Somalia, Mali, and Nigeria, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Muslim territories further east in Indonesia and other locations. Much of its ideological framework focused on eliminating American dominance from the Middle East and also dismantling the State of Israel, which it regarded as a Western stronghold in the Levant. As time passed, the group began to believe it was necessary to provoke a major conflict with the United States to radicalize the Muslim world against the kafir, or non-believers. Since the organization could not realistically engage in direct conflict at the outset, its operating methods during its formative years involved terrorist strategies. Furthermore, al-Qaeda perceived moderate Muslims as having deviated from authentic Islam, and it aimed to implement a strict version of Islamic governance throughout the Muslim world, one grounded in Sharia law, and a literal reading of the Quran. By the time al-Qaeda was founded in 1988, the war in Afghanistan was already on the verge of concluding. Upon taking leadership of the Soviet Union in 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev publicly declared his aim to end Soviet engagement in the country. However, similar to the prolonged process it took for America to fully withdraw from Vietnam, the Soviets were unable to exit immediately. In fact, in the short term, there was a notable surge in the number of Soviet troops present in Afghanistan, as Moscow sought to swiftly achieve victory through an increase in troop deployment. This effort did not yield success, as Ronald Reagan's administration persisted in sending substantial military and financial support to the Mujahideen. Indeed, once the Mujahideen received Stinger missiles to target Soviet helicopters, the guerrilla war experienced a phase of unprecedented achievement for the insurgents. Ultimately, peace agreements were signed by the Afghan government, the Soviet Union, the US, and Pakistan in 1988 and in 1989. The final Soviet troops were withdrawn. In the years that ensued, the Marxist regime began to lose increasing amounts of territory to the Mujahideen factions, and eventually fell in 1992. Yet, no sooner had the communist regime been removed than the various Mujahideen factions turned against one another. 4 years of civil conflict would ensue before one faction, known as the Taliban, rose to power in 1996, although they would never gain complete dominance over the nation, and much of the North remained under the control of the Northern Alliance into the late 1990s and early 2000s. Following the Soviet-Afghan War, bin Laden initially went back to his home country of Saudi Arabia in 1989. He was celebrated as a hero for his contributions in helping to expel the Russians from Afghanistan. Back in the Arabian Peninsula, he commenced working with the Saudi bin Laden Group, his family's enterprise, in an attempt to utilize its economic strength and business connections to aid the growth of al-Qaeda. Concurrently, he started engaging with other prominent figures of the Islamic Jihadist movement in Egypt and other regions. During this period, the relationship between bin Laden and the Saudi government began to decline. Bin Laden was determined to pursue an increasingly confrontational approach against non-Muslims, whereas the Saudi government continued to maintain its role as a crucial American ally in the Middle East. A point of contention that emerged between bin Laden and the Saudi regime concerned the South Yemen civil war. Bin Laden desired for Saudi Arabia to intervene directly to remove the Soviet-supported Yemeni Socialist Party, but the royal government in Riyadh obstructed his attempts to do so. Another problem involving a neighboring country of Saudi Arabia was soon to create tension between bin Laden and the Saudi government in ways that would ultimately end relations between him and the Saudi royal family. On the 2nd of August 1990, Saddam Hussein, the Iraqi president who had spent much of the 1980s engaged in a war against Iran, with substantial backing from the United States, invaded the small Gulf state of Kuwait, one of the wealthiest nations to which Iraq owed billions of dollars, borrowed to fund its war against Iran during the 1980s. The invasion, which resulted in the small city-state being conquered within 2 days, sparked international outrage, and within weeks, the United States was assembling a coalition of military partners to initiate a counter-invasion of Iraq, which included Britain, France, Germany, and numerous other nations. It was also endorsed by several Arab and Muslim countries, particularly Egypt, Syria, and Saudi Arabia. By the autumn of 1990, as discussions to reach a peaceful resolution were still in progress, American troops began to arrive in the Middle East for a military buildup. They traveled primarily to Saudi Arabia, which was to serve as the staging ground for the liberation of Kuwait, and an attack on Iraq should negotiations fail. That is precisely what transpired, and thus what was referred to as Operation Desert Storm by the U.S. military was launched on the 16th of January 1991. Bin Laden was infuriated from the outset of the military buildup, as the Saudi government consented to a proposal from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Dick Cheney, that America should step in to prevent any expansion of Iraq's aggression into Saudi Arabia. In reaction to this, Bin Laden arranged a meeting with the Saudi ruler, King Fahd, and urged that the country should bar American troops from gathering in Saudi Arabia and that he would deploy his own Arab Legion, created in Afghanistan during the war, to safeguard the Saudi border against any Iraqi invasion. This proposal was rejected, and the U.S. and coalition troop buildup accelerated in the following weeks. As it happened, Bin Laden began openly criticizing the Saudi government, launching a hostile propaganda campaign in which he claimed that the royal family was allowing Western infidels into the kingdom, which was the protector of the holiest sites in Islam, Mecca, and Medina. He also sought to persuade the ulama, the senior Saudi religious scholars, to issue a fatwa or religious declaration condemning the American involvement in the Arabian Peninsula. All of this culminated in a significant rift between Bin Laden and the Saudi government, leading to his expulsion from the country in 1991. Meanwhile, Operation Desert Storm swiftly defeated Iraq and liberated Kuwait in the spring of 1991. Instead of seeking regime change, the U.S. retained Saddam Hussein in power, withdrew its troops from the region, and imposed severe sanctions on Iraq. After being expelled from Saudi Arabia in 1991, Bin Laden moved to Sudan, where he settled in 1992. In 1989, Colonel Omar al-Bashir had taken control in a mostly bloodless military coup. He rapidly instituted a version of Sharia law throughout Sudan, turning the country into a fitting base for Bin Laden to carry on his operations. The Saudi Mujahideen were invited to Sudan personally by Hassan al-Turabi, the Speaker of the Sudanese National Assembly and the second most influential figure in Sudan, next to al-Bashir. Here, Bin Laden quickly established himself in a well-protected compound, with his al-Qaeda followers safeguarding the site with sophisticated weaponry. New training camps for Mujahideen were set up near the capital of Khartoum, and Bin Laden acquired a mansion in the city. Due to the unrestricted freedom he was granted in Sudan, the country was labeled as a state sponsor of international terrorism. As in the aftermath of the Gulf War, Bin Laden and al-Qaeda had come under increasing scrutiny by the American intelligence agency and the State Department. Thus, while Bin Laden remained in Sudan from 1992 to 1996, the U.S. was tracking his activities almost daily with flyovers of his compound and other intelligence collection efforts. By 1996, U.S. sanctions against Sudan for harboring Bin Laden and several other prominent Islamic fundamentalists and jihadists had started to significantly harm the country's economy. Additionally, President Omar al-Bashir had outmaneuvered Bin Laden's main supporter within the government, Hassan al-Turabi. Consequently, by 1996, it was made evident to Bin Laden that Sudan was no longer a secure haven. Following his expulsion, he returned that year to Afghanistan, where the Taliban had just solidified its control over much of the country. There, he became the personal guest of Mullah Muhammad Omar, the first leader of the Taliban government after taking power. He swiftly declared war against the United States in August 1996 through various Islamic media outlets, contending that the U.S. had occupied Saudi Arabia through its military bases since 1990, and that it was the main backer of Israel in the region. It has been theorized that Bin Laden's actions in 1996 were due to the loss of a significant portion of his wealth from his familial background upon leaving Sudan. and that the order of expulsion further radicalized bin Laden and set him on a course of total war against the United States government, whose sanctions against Sudan had influenced the stance of the Sudanese government. From his return to Afghanistan in 1996 onward, bin Laden and al-Qaeda were fully dedicated to confrontational jihadist actions, directed specifically at the United States. These actions had consistently been an element of the organization's modus operandi. As early as 1990, the Federal Bureau of Investigation had conducted a raid on the residence of Sayyid no-Sayr, an affiliate of al-Qaeda in New Jersey, where they uncovered documents related to plans for detonating skyscrapers in New York City. In 1993, a truck bomb exploded outside the North Tower of the World Trade Center in Manhattan. The operation was led by Ramzi Youssef, another known associate of al-Qaeda, who had received training in one of their camps in Afghanistan during the late 1980s. In 1992, bin Laden financed and coordinated the bombing of the Gold Mihor Hotel in the city of Aden in Yemen. It is also widely believed that al-Qaeda played a role in the Luxor massacre in November 1997 when 62 individuals, the majority being Western tourists, were murdered in the Egyptian city near the Valley of the Kings by 6 Islamic fundamentalist gunmen. Thus, by the latter half of the 1990s, al-Qaeda was escalating its assaults on Western targets using terrorist tactics. These assaults would soon intensify even more. On the 7th of August 1998, simultaneous truck bombings took place in the cities of Dar es Salaam, the capital of Tanzania, and the capital of Kenya, Nairobi. There was no question about which country was the symbolic target of these assaults, as the bombs detonated outside the United States embassies in both capital cities. There is also no doubt that bin Laden and al-Qaeda were accountable, and in the immediate aftermath of the bombings, bin Laden was included on the FBI's list of 10 most wanted individuals. It also drew the attention of all intelligence agencies in the Western world to al-Qaeda, although regrettably, the threat that the terrorist organization posed was still not fully understood. In the wake of the U.S. embassy bombings, bin Laden persisted in intensifying his rhetoric against the United States. His grievances were varied, encompassing U.S. backing of Israel and several regimes that were oppressing Muslims within their territories, particularly Russia's actions in Chechnya, the Philippine government's assaults on the Muslim Moro population in the southern islands, and India's mistreatment of Muslims in the Kashmir region up north. Nonetheless, his primary concern was with the presence of American forces in the Arabian Peninsula and their proximity to Islam's sacred sites, Mecca and Medina. In 1998, al-Qaeda declared that, for 7 years, the United States has been occupying the lands of Islam in the holiest of places. Hence, following the already significant attacks on the U.S. embassies, bin Laden and al-Qaeda focused their sights on an even larger assault, this time targeting American soil. Notably, they resolved to strike the World Trade Center in New York City, which al-Qaeda associates had previously attempted to bomb with a truck in 1993. The second attempt would prove to be much more devastating. Late in 1998 or early 1999, bin Laden authorized the World Trade Center initiative. The rest of 1999 was spent screening potential candidates to execute the attacks in Afghanistan. A requirement for the leaders was that they needed to be proficient in English and have experience living in Western society for a period. Several individuals, including Muhammad Atta, Marwan al-Sheikhi, and Ziad Jarrah, were quickly chosen. Another individual, Hani Hanjour, was selected once it became apparent that he held a commercial pilot's license and was an accomplished airplane pilot. By 2000, 19 individuals had been chosen and were being organized into terrorist cells in the United States, operating in Arizona, Florida, and California. Final targets were identified in early 2001, with the plan being to hijack multiple commercial airline planes and crash them into buildings in suicide terrorist attacks. The Twin Towers, the two main structures of the World Trade Center, were the primary targets, while the Pentagon in Virginia was also a target. Additionally, there were believed to be plans to crash a fourth plane into the U.S. Capitol building, the government's seat in Washington, D.C. With the plan set and terrorist cells positioned in the U.S. to execute it, a date was established for the coordinated attacks. The day selected was September 11, 2001. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the 19 hijackers, functioning in independent cells, began to carry out their orders. 5 hijackers boarded American Airlines Flight 11, which was set to depart from Logan International Airport in Boston at 7:59 a.m., headed for Los Angeles International Airport. 5 others boarded United Airlines Flight 175, which was making the same journey from Logan to Los Angeles. That plane took off from the Boston runway 15 minutes after American Airlines Flight 11. Meanwhile, 6 minutes later, at 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 took off from Washington Dulles International Airport in Virginia, not far from Washington, D.C. 5 hijackers were also aboard. Finally, 22 minutes later, at 8:42 a.m., a 4th plane, United Airlines Flight 93, departed from Newark International Airport in New Jersey and headed for San Francisco. There were just 4 hijackers on this flight. What followed was a day of infamy. Within minutes of becoming airborne, the hijackers on all 4 planes began their attempts to seize control of the aircraft. Consequently, at 8:46 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center, traveling at a speed of approximately 750 kilometers per hour. While people throughout Manhattan speculated if this could have been an accident, United Airlines Flight 175 was altering its course in the skies. At 9:03 a.m., 17 minutes after the first plane had struck the North Tower, it collided with the South Tower at a speed of 800 kilometers per hour. Just over half an hour later, American Airlines Flight 77 crashed into the west wall of the Pentagon in Virginia. Only United Airlines Flight 93 missed its intended target as it went down in a field in Pennsylvania, while the passengers were trying to regain control from the hijackers. The plane crashes were merely the beginning of the devastation. When the planes impacted the Twin Towers, well over 10,000 people were already inside, commencing their day's work. With the elevators rendered inoperable due to the damage from the initial impact and fires wreaking havoc on the upper floors, evacuation efforts could only proceed at a moderate pace as individuals had to navigate down dozens of staircases. The upper stories where the planes had struck were transformed into an inferno, and within moments, many of those who were still alive were leaping to their deaths. The South Tower, which had been hit second, collapsed at 9:59 a.m. It was followed 29 minutes later by the North Tower. In total, it is believed that 2,606 people lost their lives in the towers and on the ground, along with 147 passengers and crew aboard the 2 planes. The damage at the Pentagon was less severe, but even here, 125 lost their lives on the ground, along with 59 crew and passengers. All 40 crew and passengers on United Airlines Flight 93 perished. The September 11, 2001 attacks were thus the most catastrophic terrorist attacks in world history. Furthermore, since media outlets started covering the story within minutes globally, and footage of the planes hitting the towers was soon accessible, the psychological impact of the attacks was unmatched as an act of terrorism. Initially, bin Laden denied having any involvement in orchestrating the 9/11 attacks on the United States. On the 16th of September, he issued a statement that was subsequently aired by Al Jazeera, in which he denied responsibility. Reports in the second half of the 2000s at times indicated that he might have crossed the western border into Iran, but these claims were likely unfounded, and the truth is that bin Laden and al-Qaeda managed to reside in Pakistan, mostly untroubled and somewhat comfortably for years, benefiting from the tacit backing of influential factions within Pakistan's political and security apparatus. During this period, bin Laden and al-Qaeda persistently orchestrated terrorist operations throughout the broader Muslim world. Attacks targeting the United States became significantly more challenging in the wake of 9/11 due to an extensive security system established at American airports and various other sites. Nevertheless, there was no lack of Western targets now accessible in the Middle East. Initially, Afghanistan had been occupied by American, British, and other Allied forces in late 2001, and they were set to remain there in some capacity for the following 2 decades. However, a more pronounced Western presence would soon be observed in Iraq. After the early triumph over the Taliban in Afghanistan, the administration under President George W. Bush in the U.S. made it clear that it planned to pursue more regime changes in the Middle East, aiming at nations considered to be supporters of terrorism. The regime of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, which had managed to retain power following the Gulf War, was a significant focus. This strategy would not receive as much backing from America's allies as the invasion of Afghanistan did, with nations like France contending that the Bush administration was now exploiting the 9/11 attacks as a cover for regime changes in oil-rich nations and a kind of U.S. neo-imperialism in the region. Despite these concerns, the U.S. and Britain, along with several other smaller allied countries, invaded Iraq in March 2003, asserting that Hussein's regime was attempting to acquire weapons of mass destruction and had connections to bin Laden. Bin Laden had frequently pointed to the harsh economic sanctions that the U.S. had placed on Iraq after the Gulf War as one of his grievances against America, but there is no substantial evidence indicating that the Hussein regime ever materially supported bin Laden in any significant way. The invasion unfolded much like it had in Afghanistan. A quick victory was secured over the Ba'athist regime of Saddam Hussein, and within 2 months, President Bush declared U.S. victory in the conflict. However, things were not so straightforward, and similar to Afghanistan, a brutal counterinsurgency campaign commenced in the summer of 2003, extending for years as various factions within Iraq sought to expel U.S. forces from the nation. Bin Laden and al-Qaeda played roles in this internal conflict. Their strategies were aimed at creating divisions between the Sunni Muslim minority and the Shiite Muslim majority in an attempt to incite a civil war across Iraq. Conventional terrorist tactics were utilized, such as the bombing of the al-Askari shrine in the city of Samarra on the 22nd of February 2006. Although this event did not lead to a large-scale loss of life, it did involve the devastation of one of the most sacred sites in Iraq for Shiite Muslims, and ignited several days of sectarian violence in Baghdad and other areas where at least 1,000 individuals perished. Ultimately, by the late 2000s, the conflict in Iraq started to stabilize as a notable American troop increase in 2007, coupled with political reforms, helped to reduce the most severe violence. Yet, al-Qaeda persisted in their efforts, and from Pakistan, bin Laden approved bombings in Baghdad, and a suicide attack on the Shiite Imam Hussein shrine in Karbala in March 2008 that resulted in 42 fatalities and injured many more. Meanwhile, in Pakistan, bin Laden had relocated to a newly constructed compound in Abbottabad in northern Pakistan. Construction on this facility seemingly commenced shortly after bin Laden arrived in the country at the start of 2002 and was finished in 2005. The compound occupied a 38,000 square foot estate, enclosed by a concrete perimeter wall rising to 5.5 meters high and armed with barbed wire on top. There were minimal windows in the compound, with numerous screens installed to obstruct views of the inside, including a privacy screen on a third-floor balcony that was sufficiently tall to afford bin Laden, who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, privacy. It is hard to accept that the authorities could not have noticed how extraordinary the new property was, as it was designed with security as a priority. Bin Laden likely resided there from 2006 onward with some of his wives, children, and followers in a city not far from the capital of Pakistan, Islamabad. While bin Laden's compound provided him shelter in Pakistan for numerous years, ultimately, his excessive dependence on it would lead to his downfall. In 2009, U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, a close associate of bin Laden's, believed to have been at the Battle of Tora Bora in December 2001, when the terrorist leader narrowly escaped capture by the U.S., had begun serving as a reliable courier and messenger for him during his time in hiding in Pakistan. In 2009, the CIA confirmed that al-Kuwaiti was residing in Abbottabad. Further intelligence efforts allowed them to recognize the bin Laden compound as an unusual building in the city. The U.S. Congress provided tens of millions of dollars to facilitate the formation of a CIA team in Abbottabad, which began monitoring the compound and its visitors in 2010. Despite this comprehensive operation and the deployment of the most advanced drone and surveillance technology accessible globally, the team was never successful in acquiring a photograph or any concrete evidence that definitively proved bin Laden was living within the compound. But by early 2011, the volume of circumstantial evidence was such that they were certain this was the hideout of the mastermind behind the 9/11 attacks. U.S. President Barack Obama authorized what was known as Operation Neptune Spear on May 1, 2011. It was lunchtime in Washington, D.C., but only 30 minutes later, at nearly 11 p.m. in Afghanistan, 2 Black Hawk helicopters carrying 24 Navy SEALs departed from an American air base in Afghanistan and flew across the border into Pakistan. Just over an hour and a half later, at what was midnight in Pakistan on May 2nd, the helicopters touched down in the compound at Abbottabad. One of the helicopters malfunctioned during the landing, but none of the Navy SEALs sustained injuries. Combat began as soon as they arrived, with a brief firefight against some of bin Laden's followers. Afterwards, the Navy SEALs advanced into the main compound. Back in Washington, D.C., President Obama and senior government and defense officials observed live footage of the raid from the Situation Room in the White House. On the second floor, the Navy SEALs confronted and shot one of bin Laden's many adult sons, as well as another follower, Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, whose presence in Abbottabad initially indicated to the security services that bin Laden might be hiding in the city. Then, as they ascended the stairs again, they discovered bin Laden on the 3rd floor. Their orders were to kill rather than capture the al-Qaeda leader. There are differing accounts about what then happened, as various Navy SEALs have attempted to claim credit for killing bin Laden, but it appears most likely that it was Matt Bissonnette who shot bin Laden at 39 minutes past midnight local time, in the body and head at the doorway of his bedroom, causing him to stagger backward into the room and collapse to the floor, lifeless. Bin Laden was found to have €500 and 2 mobile phones sewn into his robes, undoubtedly for use if he found himself escaping an attack on the compound, like the one that resulted in his death. It was a rather ignoble end. A decision had been made in advance that bin Laden's body would be disposed of swiftly in a location where his resting place would never be discovered and turned into a shrine for Islamic fundamentalists and jihadists. Therefore, shortly after he was killed and the compound was completely secured, the Navy SEALs placed the al-Qaeda leader's body in a body bag and then transported it to the helicopter that remained intact. After conducting a sweep of the compound to collect any intelligence that might help prevent further terrorist attacks or establish a clearer understanding of what bin Laden had been doing over the years, the team departed the compound with the body on the only operational helicopter. A backup helicopter was summoned to retrieve some of the remaining Navy SEALs. By 8 p.m. back in Washington, it was confirmed that the body was that of bin Laden. A few hours later, President Obama spoke to the nation to announce the success of the raid. While he was doing so, bin Laden's body was being transported to an undisclosed location at sea for disposal, weighed down with iron chains and rocks to ensure it sank to the seafloor. This was accomplished within 24 hours of his death to adhere to Islamic tradition. Unfortunately, the demise of Osama bin Laden did not result in any decrease in the threat posed by Islamic fundamentalists and jihadists to the Western world, or even to most Muslims within the Islamic world. As ruthless as their methods were, al-Qaeda was already being overshadowed by more extreme jihadi factions by the time of bin Laden's death. In 2004, a Jordanian jihadist by the name of Abu Musab al-Zarqawi became affiliated with al-Qaeda in Iraq during the early phases of the counterinsurgency against the U.S. occupation. In 2006, al-Zarqawi and several of his closest associates combined forces to establish what they called the Islamic State of Iraq. In the subsequent years, they grew increasingly powerful, yet their tactics also escalated in brutality, employing vicious methods against Muslims who would not conform to anything other than the strictest interpretations of Sharia law. By the time U.S. forces withdrew from Iraq in the early 2010s, al-Qaeda was becoming less tolerant of this style of jihad in the Middle East, leading to a complete split between the two organizations in the years following bin Laden's death under al-Qaeda's new leadership, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Remarkably, by the 2010s, al-Qaeda, the organization responsible for the 9/11 attacks, was perceived as too moderate by many Islamic fundamentalists, while the Islamic State of Iraq group was gaining significantly more followers among aspirant jihadists. In the years that ensued, the Islamic State of Iraq made a significant impact on the global stage. Following the Arab Spring of 2011, a brutal civil war broke out in Syria, and the U.S. withdrawal from neighboring Iraq led to considerable portions of the country falling out of the Baghdad government's control. In the years that ensued, the Islamic State of Iraq made a significant impact on the global stage. Following the Arab Spring of 2011, a brutal civil war broke out in Syria, and the U.S. withdrawal from neighboring Iraq led to considerable portions of the country falling out of the Baghdad government's control. In this context, the Islamic State, under its new leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was able to begin exerting direct control over a vast expanse of territory across northern Iraq and eastern Syria. Throughout 2014 and 2015, the newly named Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, or ISIL, gained international notoriety as it declared the establishment of an Islamic caliphate over the lands it had seized. ISIL escalated Islamic jihad to a new level of savagery that even al-Qaeda distanced itself from. Gradually, control over eastern Syria and northern Iraq was wrested from ISIL between 2014 and 2017 as the U.S. redeployed troops to the region. As of the early 2000s and 20s, Islamic fundamentalism appears to be in decline, influenced in part by rapidly improving living conditions in the Middle East, a diminished desire for nation-building by the United States in the area, and a warming of relations between Israel and numerous Muslim neighbors. Thus, the narrative of Osama bin Laden reaches its conclusion, but its reverberations continue to influence the world we inhabit. To some, he represented a freedom fighter, opposing what he perceived as oppression. To others, he epitomized terror, accountable for some of the most catastrophic attacks in contemporary history. Regardless of viewpoint, his actions left an imprint that no one could overlook. The emergence of bin Laden signified a pivotal moment in international politics. He confronted the most dominant nations, redefined warfare's nature, and compelled the world to face new types of conflict, where the adversary lacked borders, uniforms, and fear of mortality. His demise in 2011 might have closed a chapter, but it did not conclude the narrative. The ideologies he endorsed, the wars he impacted, and the lives he unsettled continue to resonate throughout the Middle East and beyond. As we reflect on his life, we confront challenging inquiries. How did one individual come to wield such influence? What motivated him to take the course he took? And most crucially, what insights can we gain from his rise and decline? I hope you found this video helpful and inspiring. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content like this. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know what topics you'd like to see next. Thank you for watching.